Session 7 is on contract to closing. And this is where we're going to prepare the contract, and let's hope that we're going to get it to the closing. That's what this is all about. So let me first of all start out with contracts and what contracts are about. Remember that a contract is a mutual meeting of the minds. It's what parties know that they've agreed to. There has to be an offer, there has to be an acceptance of that offer, and there has to be a communication back in order to create the contract. And I think it's important for you to understand at this point, that concept, that until you have that communication back, you have nothing. That any party, either party, can simply walk away from the transaction. And in any contract situation where we're negotiating, you have a person who's going to make an offer, that's the offeror, that's the giver of the offer, and we have the offeree, that's the receiver of the offer. And remember this, that in the offering or that whole process, that if the person receiving that offer doesn't like what they see and they want to do a counter offer, that offeree now becomes the offeror, and the offeror now becomes the offeree. So they change roles out there. Let's talk about the contract itself and how that thing works. Obviously, there's going to be some important parts to it. And let's talk about the dates of the contract. And I think the most important date that we have to deal with is the effective date, because everything pivots around the effective date. How soon they have to make application for their loan, how long it takes to get their loan, when they have their home inspection done. Everything pivots around that one date. And the effective date by definition is the date that the last party sign or initial, and that all parties have received a copy of the contract. Now let me say this also. It does not necessarily have to go back to the buyer and seller for them to receive it. It can actually be communicated back to their agent, and that's as far as it has to go. But there has to be some communication back to the parties or their agent. When we're talking about the types of title we can take property in, I think what we have to say is that if let's just say that you've got a husband and wife that want to buy a second home or an investment property. In most cases, husbands and wives take title as tenants by the entirety. That's the husband and wife with the right of survivorship. But what if they wanted to leave title property to kids they had in another marriage? How would they do that? They couldn't do it as tenants by the entirety. The only way they could do it is if they were tenants in common, because a tenant in common does not have the right of survivorship. Earnest money deposits typically are collected. It doesn't have to be. And let me make a comment about earnest money deposits. Brokers can actually collect post-dated checks and promissory notes. It's not a common practice, I've got to tell you. But if you do that, you have to get the seller's permission up front before you do it. Legal description, financing terms, everything has to be filled out as part of the contract. Also make sure that if you have any personal property or chattel, that you might want to describe that as well, because remember, the sale of real estate is real property only and everything permanently attached. Any personal property has to be agreed upon by the parties. Also remember that breach of contract, either buyer or seller could breach a contract. And what we say is that there are a lot of remedies for breach of contract. The earnest money deposit is tendered by the buyer. If the buyer breaches, typically speaking, that seller is going to retain the earnest money as liquidated damages. But let there be no doubt that both parties can sue for specific performance if they choose to. And there's other remedies as well. So there are more remedies than just keeping deposits. As far as your disclosures are concerned, licensees have to be keenly aware of all the various disclosures that are required by law or that's required by the Florida Realtors to make sure that we're protected in terms of our contract negotiations. Radon gas, agency, energy efficiency, lead-based paint. There's all kinds of disclosures that we have to make sure that we make. As far as stigmatized properties are concerned, let me tell you what a stigmatized property is. A stigmatized property is a property where there's been a homicide or a suicide. The state of Florida, state statute, says that disclosing stigmatized properties is not a requirement of a licensee. In other words, it's not like lead-based paint or some of these other things. So if there's been a homicide or suicide, you need to talk to the seller and say, look, here's the deal. This is not something that I have to disclose, but if somebody asks me specifically if this actually occurred, I can't lie. So you're going to have a discussion with the seller about that, because neighbors talk, and there are some buyers out there that may get upset about that issue. The agent's role in closing and that closing process. Obviously, there's going to be some preliminary steps that have to be done. There's got to be title work done. There's got to be surveys done. There's got to be termite inspections done. There's a lot of things that have to be done before you can go to the closing. But once all those things are checked off and you've got them, over here saying that we've already done them all, now we're going to move to the closing. Remember this, that when we're talking about insurance, title insurance, that's going to be one of the issues. Buyers have the right to review their title binder at least 5 days prior to closing. Now, that title binder will tell them about all of the various exceptions to title, if there are any. And let me say this about title insurance. There's two types. There's an owner's policy that's basically based on the sales price. And then there's a mortgagee policy. That's the lender's policy. And let me tell you what the difference is. The owner's policy is not transferable. Every new owner has to get their own policy. The mortgagee policy, on the other hand, is transferable. And let me tell you why. Most of your lenders are going to take the mortgage and note and they're going to sell it to an investor, the secondary mortgage market. That title insurance policy is going to follow that mortgage and note wherever it goes. So we say that it is transferable wherever that mortgage and note goes. There's going to be a closing statement that is going to have to be delivered. We call it a disclosure, closing disclosure statement. I want you to remember that lenders are required to provide a copy of the disclosure notice, the closing disclosure notice, and allow the borrower at least 3 business days prior to closing to review that document. That is a requirement. So if they deliver it on a Monday, the final disclosure document, they've got Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to review. You're going to close it on a Friday. So it's going to expand our closing period right now. The Internal Revenue Service is going to get involved in this as well, especially when it comes to foreign investors. And we're talking about foreign sellers. And the way that it's set up is that if you're dealing with a seller that is not a citizen of the United States or that is a foreign investor, at the closing, if they're the seller, the IRS is going to require that 10% of the realized gain has to be taken and put in a fund set aside for the Internal Revenue Service. Now, that's only for foreign investors. Post-closing activities, you need to be down to pick up a copy of the closing disclosure, the check, and get it back to the office. Review what you've done. And I got to tell you what might be a smart thing to do is sit down and reflect over the closing itself, reflect over the whole entire transaction and say, what were some of the positive things? What were some of the negative things? What can I do to make the next closing a little bit better? And with that said, what I'd like to do right now is review with you this final chapter so that we understand all those areas of critical concern. To create a contract, there must be an offer, an acceptance, and a communication back. Offerors make the offer, offerees receive the offer. The effective date of the contract is the date that the last parties have signed and all parties have received a copy of the contract. A tenant in common does not have the right of survivorship. Sellers can retain the earnest money if the buyer breaches. We call that liquidated damages. Some of the required disclosures: radon gas, lead-based paint, and those are for homes built prior to 1978, energy efficiency, and material defects. A stigmatized property is one where there's been a homicide or a suicide that's occurred, and this is not a required disclosure of a licensee. The lender's title insurance policy is transferable and becomes assignable. The Truth in Lending RESPA requirements for banks say that banks have to provide the borrower with a closing disclosure at least 3 business days prior to their closing. FIRPTA has to do with foreign investors, and this requires the closing agent to withhold 10% of the realized gain on the sale of real property by a non-citizen of the United States. And that's all we have for this chapter.